It's my pleasure now to introduce Bob Kolasky from Department of Homeland Security. He's going to speak on increasing resilience for position, navigation, and timing. So can we welcome Bob? And I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. I'm sure it's going to be very, very interesting. We have a stair over here. Oh, you're a big man here. Here's your tool.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Pat, for having me here. And I'm pleased to be here with all of you. Intimidated always to be in a room like this, with this setting and the rich history, and then to be sitting out here giving a talk to a bunch of people who know a lot more about the subject than I know about. So I'm not going to try to teach you anything about timing for the finance industry. You all know that, and you're going to spend the day talking about it. I want to step back for a second and just talk about this as a Homeland Security and a national security imperative, give you a little sense of how within the Department of Homeland Security, the U.S. government, we approach working with industry to address risks to the nation's critical infrastructure, risks to things that are important to the way we do business in a way that hopefully facilitates and continues to facilitate the economic activity, commerce, and the work that all of you do. What we really try to do within the Department of Homeland Security as we talk about critical infrastructure protection is to take a risk management approach to provide better information about where we see risks to things that are important to the nation's security, and then to partner with industry to address those risks using whatever levers the Department or the U.S. government may have to address those risks, but also relying on market-based solutions. And I think this is a conference where you're talking about this issue for the importance first and foremost for continued business viability, but that quickly becomes things that matter for security purposes. My part of the Department of Homeland Security, the Office of Infrastructure Protection, is in the broader part of DHS that has responsibility for cybersecurity and critical infrastructure protection. We work very closely with the financial industry, the Department of Treasury, others in the financial industry to address the largest risks we see. Most prominently over the last several years, obviously, have been the emerging threat of cybersecurity incidents and the consequences related to that. But we don't want to get stuck just working on one issue, and so we have over time continued to work with industry and others to try to understand where there are risks that could have significant impact to the nation's critical infrastructure. And it's quickly become evident, and perhaps it's been evident to a number of you for a while, that reliability on GPS services, the need to have reliable position and navigation timing services is absolutely essential for how a lot of our critical infrastructure operates. Going to my first slide. When I talk about critical infrastructure, I talk about in terms, within the government, we've divided that into 16 critical infrastructure sectors. You see a depiction of many of the sectors up here. We have energy, electricity, oil, natural gas. We have emergency services, healthcare, public health, the water sector, transportation sector, banking and finance, et cetera. And here's a list. Most of those, including finance, are heavily reliant on the belief in the ability to have reliable position and navigation timing services. For transportation, position and navigation become very important. For banking and finance, it's timing, and for other sectors, it's a combination of both. And so as we sit and think about what are the things that present risks to critical infrastructure, not having those reliable services is clearly one of those. There is a large reliance, although as I understand it, it is perhaps shifting a little bit, but there's a large reliance on global positioning servicing technology, GPS technology. There's a lot of interesting things going on internationally into other competing GNSS systems, but here in the US, there's sort of a mandate, and there will likely continue to be a mandate to use GPS as the primary GNSS, global navigation system. And we know from what we see and what we've seen from potential adversaries, from the threats that we've seen, that there is an interest and there's at least some thinking about, is this a vulnerability that can be exploited by particularly nation states who are interested in doing damage to this country? Since there's such a reliability, we are concerned that is recognized by countries that want to do us harm or may want to do us harm. Without going too far into that, we've seen a sort of pickup of the reporting as this might be something that is of interest if people are interested to cause trouble to this country. And that's really why the Department of Homeland Security is in business, as you all know. So the threat seems to be morphing. The threat seems to be out there. GPS technology, position navigation technology, continues to have some vulnerabilities based on our analysis. There are too many examples. There seems to be too much evidence of the feasibility of jamming and spoofing and other ways to degrade GPS services. And so when threat meets vulnerability, you start to have looks like a little bit of an increased risk. One of the things, and I hope, and will be one of the themes of this at this conference, will be how do you reduce some of the vulnerabilities. I'll talk about that later in my remarks. But you have threats and vulnerabilities out there, and then as I was talking about in terms of the nature of criticality and the nature of critical infrastructure, there are consequences that are fairly significant to our economy, to your businesses, to facilitate the American way of life if there is a loss of GPS, if there's a loss of position, navigation, timing, and then for some sectors, if there's a loss in particular of timing capability. And that's what gets us motivated. When we see increased threat, vulnerability, and consequences, we see increased risk. As I said from the beginning, I hope we can work with you and all of you in the industry as the department to address the risk without putting in place a bunch of solutions that don't make sense within a business environment. And so the Department of Homeland Security is not out here to do anything in particular other than to elevate the attention that we give to the risk of degraded services and to then work with our interagency and private sector partners to try to do things to address the risk. And to hopefully, the easiest part of my job maybe is just to motivate action and call attention to things. And a lot of what we've been trying to do within DHS is to call attention to this and then better understand the risk and where there are gaps. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the rest of my remarks. So I've hit on a lot of these with dependence comes risk themes. Critical infrastructure, again, are the essential services and functions that underpin our economy and our nation's security. And what are the things that can cause significant degradation of critical infrastructure in the finance industry? It is timing services. You all rely on these for so much for your transactions, for the encryption of your transactions, for the synchronization of your transactions, et cetera. So it's something worth thinking about. So I think I've kind of hit that. So what does that mean? And what are we here to sort of, hopefully, as I said, motivate in terms of activity? Andy mentioned the best practices that we published earlier this month. There's a link on my last slide in terms of the best practices that we published. But we'll start with putting best practices out there. So the best practices are really for users of GPS, timing systems, PNT systems. And they include things like to obscure antennas, to provide decoy antennas, to carefully select antenna locations, avoid using low elevation signals, employ blocking antennas, redundancy, and cyber hygiene. And we are big proponents of the cybersecurity framework that the National Institute of Standards and Technology put out a few years ago that was developed in consultation with critical infrastructure owners and operators. And everywhere that I go, I hope I can encourage you and your businesses to adopt and use the cybersecurity framework. It is a nice collection of standards and best practices to help address cybersecurity risk. We are trying to learn from where we've had success by putting out best practices, and I think the GPS PNT best practices that we put out are a good start. Andy referenced they're about 20 pages, so they're a relatively light lift to read and think about, and hopefully, not knowing exactly where all of you fit in terms of your role, you can encourage promulgation of the best practices, even if you're not in a position to implement the best practices based on what you do. So that's the first thing. We want to get that word out there that there are best practices. Best practices, as they connote, those are not standards, those are not required, those are voluntary things, but as we start to get to consensus amongst industry on the best things that do, hopefully we can elevate the risk management approach. The second area, and we are very much in this business within the Department of Homeland Security, is to assess contingencies. Think through what are the implications if you can't operate with the capabilities that you're used to operating within, and so in this case, timing. Do you have a plan in place? Have you charted out scenarios? We do most of our contingency planning around imagining what it looks like on that bad day, thinking through what are all the lines of effort that you would have to put in place to be resilient to that bad day. Where are the things, how are you going to respond, how are you going to recover, how are you going to operate without the system, where's your backup, do you have backup, are you relying on something that may not operate at that time? Even if you've thought through backups, are there going to be other sort of cascading impacts? Doing that in a way where you get people who are responsible for managing, dealing with that contingency around the table and talk through the potential scenario inevitably leads to lessons learned and perhaps some activities that you can take and some investments you can make to address the contingencies. The third area that we would love to work with many of you in this room about is partnering with our Science and Technology Directorate on studies that we continue to do, particularly with manufacturers and operators of components of the P&T system, the Position Navigation Timing System, timing operators, to understand how the technologies work, how they're made, the inner workings of it, where there are perhaps vulnerabilities, and then how they're used in use cases. And so I think in this room we probably have a rich group of sort of people who are involved in the technology piece and people who are involved with the financial industry. And so we are working closely, and we've worked through protections that we have as the department to sort of do this off the record is how I would talk about it, where we really work till we test these and we understand things so that as we develop best practices and so that we move toward things like what are standards for equipment, we have a better understanding of the vulnerabilities. We're going to continue to be doing that, and I'm joined here by my colleagues Jim Platt and Rob Crane from the Department of Homeland Security. They can tell you more information about the particular tests that we're going to be doing, but I think there's an opportunity to get involved. So too is there an opportunity to get involved in continued studies that we're doing on the overall requirements, the importance of timing in particular to the finance industry. We are contracting with Johns Hopkins, and we're about to initiate a study to validate what the position timing requirements are for the financial services and emergency service sector. We've already done studies for wireless communications and electricity. Going back to the slide I had of the different critical infrastructure sectors, the ones that seem to be most reliant on P&T, we're starting there on position and navigation timing, and we're really trying to understand the reliance, how the use cases, how the systems interface with the delivery of the essential services and functions so that we can do a better job. I laid out a scenario at the beginning of threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences, but we can do a better job of understanding particularly the consequence and vulnerability elements of the risk equation. So for those of you who are interested in learning more about the study and working that, and be part of what we're doing, again, that's another ask of you that we're happy to have industry partners help us understand the requirements. The big policy question that right now that's energizing a lot of this is, do we have a national security, national economic requirement for redundancy that looks like some sort of investment in a national system for redundancy for elements of GPS. Our requirements studies are meant to feed into answering that question. I don't have the slide here. My slides up here had slides, the National Defense Authorization Act, which was just passed by Congress in December of this year urged us to very quickly answer that question because Congress is interested in whether there is a need for a national investment in redundant capabilities. The Defense Department, for executing the elements of their warfighting mission, certainly feels like they need to have absolute assurance that there will not be failure in position, navigation, and timing, absolute assurance that nothing can happen from our adversaries that would cause degradation or the inability to execute elements of the arsenal because of position, navigation, timing. The Defense Department has put a lot of time and effort and will continue to build the capability. We have GPS, after all, because of work from the Defense Department and others. Do we need similar assurances, and to what level do we need similar assurances for the civilian infrastructure? That's what Congress has asked us to look at. That returns to how I started my talk. That's what we're trying to answer. We don't know, and I hit on some similar things, we don't know how this all works without working with all of you in this room. And that's why we've invested in hiring people who work on this full time. That's why we have, we're up in conferences like this. We want to understand so that we can answer the question of to what degree is there a national security imperative to make sure the timing systems work, to what degree do our finance institutions, we know it relies on, we know you all rely on that. We know it's crucially important to your businesses. What is the risk out there, and how do we address it? The rest, I suspect most of the day we'll be talking about the particulars of that, and I understand, we fully understand that this is not a national security conversation. First and foremost, it's about your businesses, but I do hope that all of you recognize that it is something that is critical to the functioning of our economy, and because of that, it's something that should and will remain a priority, assuring that we have assurances that the timing will work. So with that, I'm happy to take some questions. Sure.
Hi, Richard Funderburk from Trimble. Do you happen to know when they're looking at alternatives to GPS, are they relying also on being sensitive to the ubiquitous nature of GPS and the amount that it is used in the private sector, cost-wise? So even, adding pennies to a cost of implementing some of these GPS receivers makes it unusable within some of the private sector.
I mean, the short answer is yes, that has to be part of the equation, and any cost-benefit analysis related to that. I mean, when I'm talking about looking at alternatives, I think we start by looking at terrestrial solutions and what are sort of low-cost terrestrial solutions. I don't know how that then interfaces with the cost to use it, but that has to be, we would never put a requirement out there without a cost-benefit study related to that. And if you can build a low-cost system that doesn't cost much to design and operate, but then costs a lot to operate, then that's unlikely to do the trick, right?
Hi, I'm Mark Weiss, for consulting, chair of WSTS. One of the backup strategies that's been proposed is to bring E-Loran to life. Can you talk about the status of that? Is that moving forward? Is that still a possibility?
I think it is still a possibility. It is a live question. We have tested E-Loran. Our Science and Technology Directorate has tested elements of E-Loran in different settings. I think a lot of the congressional urgency is around the more time goes away. It's costs more money, or the putting E-Loran in place, because as the Loran towers, the Coast Guard takes down elements of the Loran towers. We've already lost some of the ability to quickly put up an E-Loran system, but I'm sort of taught not to say that there's a single answer to that, but ELRAN seems to be still the one that motivates the most interest, and we're certainly studying that as we do the requirements. The degree to which ELRAN meets those requirements will be part of the evaluation. Hey, Dana.
Hi, Bob. How are you?
How would you answer that question, Dana?
My question was about, you said you were looking to see whether or not there was a requirement. Wasn't there a requirement established by presidential directive in 2004 for a complementary and backup system? And I think President Obama verified that when he came into office as well.
Dana, thanks. Yeah, there was a presidential directive in 2004. I don't mean, so when I'm talking about requirements, it's what are the, understanding what are the industry requirements for the functioning of critical infrastructure. I think the policy of the U.S. government continues to be, and we have a new administration, so we'll see what happens with the new administration, but that we need to have, these services need to work, and we need to have assurance they'll work in the face of problems. And again, the analysis that we're conducting is then understanding the nuances of that so we can meet the requirement. I know Dana, and we've talked before, and you've talked to my boss. We fundamentally believe in the department that we need to chase after the policy directive that's in place and make sure that we can provide guarantees that there are redundant capabilities and that these services will not fail. We are working with our Department of Transportation and Department of Defense colleagues and others around that. We're just figuring out what the right way to implement it in a way that brings into the fact that 2004 was a long time ago.
Hi, this is Tom Pfeiffer. I'm with Booz Allen. Quick question. I'm probably one of the few people here that kind of live and breathe the DoD intel world and have an opportunity to speak with all of you. But when I think about the Department of Homeland Security, it seems like the 16 critical infrastructures, at least the vast majority of the 16 are dependent on one aspect of P, N, or T. And we talk about the vulnerabilities of GPS. We all know what they are. But I'm just curious, meanwhile, back at the ranch, the Air Force is developing a more robust version of GPS for the military. It's called M-Code, and it has a stronger anti-jam, a spoof capability. And I'm just curious if any of that kind of capability, it wouldn't be extended to all of us in this room, but would it be extended to any parts of DHS? And maybe you don't want to speak to that, but it just kind of as it's one aspect is, to protect it, make GPS available to a community, so.
Yeah, when the Defense Department decides to invest heavily in some things, it tends to, I think things tend to transfer down into the economy as a whole and opportunities. I don't know exactly how that works, but yeah, I think that needs to be part of the equation. I'll take one more.
Richard Lindsay, Windstream Communications. My question is simply this, as a global business exchange today in our environment, synchronization isn't just a national question, it's an international question. And the synchronization across all of our communication networks as well as our information exchange platforms is required to be internationally synced from Europe, Asia, wherever it may come from, with our systems here. Is there an effort underway to look at that international standard of synchronization?
Yeah, that probably exceeds my knowledge of specifics. There is to some degree. We've been in conversation with the FCC, the State Department on these issues, sat around the table related to that. We're just urging a balance between, so international standards are good, international use of international services introduce new threats and vulnerabilities into the equation. And so we want to make sure that there's a balance between reliance on international services that then perhaps give people outside the country access to do harm to us. But in general, international standards and ways to allow you to operate sort of globally is something that I certainly promote, and we've tried to do the same thing in cybersecurity. So thank you again, and appreciate it, and enjoy the conference, and thanks for having me.